Okay, hello everyone and welcome. Thanks for joining us today. We're about to get started. I'll just take care of a couple of technological issues as we do that. I'm currently unmuting our panelists. And as we begin, if you could all keep yourselves muted for the first part of the conversation, we'd appreciate that. Nothing against you, but just knowing that there's always background noise in everyone's space. And when it all comes together, it can be rather cloudy. That said, we do want to have a conversation today. You all have the capacity to unmute your own microphones. So if you, in your screen, have the capacity to mute both your microphone and your video, so you can make your choices about the video. But please keep your microphone muted until you're interested in talking and contributing, which we look forward to. Also, I'll share my screen in just a second to share a little bit about Global SL. But also by way of background, the people who have been behind bringing this webinar forward are very interested in the ways in which online we might have opportunity to build community in between moments we can see each other at conferences or things of that nature. So I suppose in some way there's intentionality of screen sharing so that we can see one another and know one another and start to work together in this way. So that's part of why we haven't just packaged a set of slides for the conversation moving forward. This webinar is being recorded, and if you, well, certainly just sharing that so that you're aware of that. It is being recorded, and as with the previous webinar, we will likely post it to the website globalsl.org. So a few logistics there, and I'm going to go through a bit of overview and then get started with our panelists who I'm very excited to hear from. So first, I'd just like to share, I hope you can all see my screen at this point. If you could nod if you're looking at the website, Global SL. And I do believe many of you are familiar with this. I see some nodding. But to be clear what we're doing here, we're a network that's dedicated to mobilizing knowledge, supporting ideal global partnerships and solidarity, which covers a great array of research and possibilities, but what we work to do here is to amass that, assemble it, and move it outward. So in terms of moving it outward, for example, we have blog posts. Our most recent's actually from Richard Kiely, one of our panelists today. We work to do the webinars. We also pick up guest blogs, which I'm mentioning in the hope that some of you might want to contribute at some point. Guest blogs from faculty members and staff members around the world who are somehow dealing with critical issues relating to best practice global learning, whether that's domestically or internationally, whether it's about partnership principles or student learning or community member insights and community outcomes. So a great diversity of content that goes into the blog. We always welcome guest contributors. And we also have amassed a fair bit of research in these particular strands. This is all peer-reviewed research relating to, for example, community-driven development going back many years. We really try to privilege and prioritize open access content. So when we link to things, most of the time, it goes directly to a peer-reviewed piece that you can access regardless of whether you're with a university or not. We also have practitioner tools like sample syllabi. If you have anything to contribute, we'd really appreciate that, as well as planning tools for partnerships and particular activities inside the classroom. So that's a little bit about Global SL. As I mentioned, we're a network, and I did want to thank the institutions that help us have people continuously amassing resources and putting them together and moving them out. And at the moment, those institutions include the Luce Foundation, Cornell, Duke, Kansas State, University of Minnesota, Northwestern, Washington University, University of Kentucky, and the organizations Amazaji and Child Family Health International. And more institutions and organizations are actually in the process of joining what we like to think of as a movement supporting best practice global partnerships and solidarity. So there's a bit of background. I'll take the sharing off for the moment so we can be in conversation. By way of introduction, we moved to online dialogues just recently, and we've had some opportunity to pilot this. We've had one already, and we discovered in that first webinar that there are many co-conspirators out there in the world that we hadn't previously worked with, and we really appreciate how this does give us opportunity to learn from people who we haven't met previously at conferences, et cetera. Sometimes when I say we, I'm just generally referring to this global SL network. I don't speak in royal we terms. But in any case, it's really a pleasure to meet co-conspirators, and we're excited to have conversation and contribution from you all today. In fact, there's a bit of a deliberate move here. The feedback from the first webinar essentially said there were 80 people in 1 hour and a lot of presentations, so how can we be in conversation? So we've shifted a little, tried to market it less. You only got here if you were rather interested, and worked to be quite clear that we're not attempting to do a how-to today or a global service learning 101, but rather a conversation about meaning making together. And in that vein, we very much look forward to your contributions. As I mentioned earlier, you can unmute yourself to jump in at any point, as well as everybody has chat functionality, so you can click on and send a chat. I see that there's been a little chatting. Sorry, it's hard to keep up when I'll be good at keeping up the chat when the panelists are presenting. But Bob's letting Jessica know that chat can be seen by everyone. And incidentally, you can chat to individuals. If you ever need to message me directly, just click on the left side where it says Eric Hartman, and the everyone, of course, sends to everyone. And let's see. I believe just a final bit of reflections before we go into the conversation. This also came to the fore because the folks I've had the good fortune to work with over the last several years, we're preparing to put together another pre-conference for the International Association for Research on Service Learning Community Engagement. In the process, we surfaced a number of issues we're continuously trying to grapple with, one of which was we would really love to hear more from NGO directors and practitioners. That was actually webinar number 1. We heard directly from those folks. And we'd like to broaden out the conversation before we get to the webinar. So we will be learning from you all today and better understanding as we move toward the pre-conference, which is on how knowledge grows from partnerships and not merely inside universities, broadly speaking. So that, I think everyone knows we have an incredible group of panelists join us today. I'm very excited. Richard Kiely, of course, is the Director of Engaged Learning and Research at Cornell University. Janice McMillan is the Director of the Global Citizens Program at the University of Cape Town. And Cynthia Toms is the Director of Global Engagement at Westmont University in California. That introduction reminds me, we're also harnessing the power of the internet to bring together 9 a.m. in California and 6 p.m. in South Africa. And we appreciate everyone making times in their day to be part of the conversation. So I thought I'd start by inviting the panelists, and maybe, let's see, if we went alphabetically, we'd start with Richard. We'll just have to see who's most eager to start. But the description suggests that we'd be thinking about how the values and disruption associated with global service learning respond to critiques, such as those offered by Boniface Mwangi, who suggested help your own country. I wonder if the panelists could respond to this question of how the way they approach global service learning responds to the critiques that suggest help your own country. And before letting go of the microphone and hearing from the panelists, one last thing. I've actually been in dialogue with Boniface Mwangi, who's obviously an incredibly skilled community organizer an activist in Kenya. And he's enthusiastic about these conversations. Hasn't been able to join us for one yet, but of course we'd love it if we'd be able to bring him in at some point. So we do continue to work at things like that. So hello and good morning, Richard, Janice, Cynthia. Love to hear from you. Just beginning your thinking here, and we can move forward from there.
Do you want to go alphabetical, or do you got Janice, Cynthia?
Sure, Richard. Why don't you go ahead?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I remember when that video was going around email and social media, and I immediately reached out to a number of colleagues, including folks here and on the panel. And, I think it was a provocative video. It was difficult not to react or respond to that. And my typical response to something like that is great opportunity for dialogue, because it raised a number of questions in my mind, being someone who believes very strongly that global service learning, that is going to other places and doing good things with other people who you might not normally engage with in your own locality, can be a very powerful and useful and beneficial experience. So my first reaction was to kind of reflect on my own assumptions about whether or not, what I'm doing and what my colleagues are doing, and that is going across borders in multiple contexts, locally or regionally or globally. What kind of benefits does it have? What are the issues and challenges? And I think most of the folks that I've worked with over the past 20 years, there are certain ways of approaching usually there's off that critique of staying home and helping your locality comes up a lot. And so that's something that when I first started doing this work in '94, some of my international colleagues raised that question to me. So this is something that doesn't have a complete answer, but it's something to dialogue about. One of the ways that I approach it, there are a number of different ways to approach it, but one is just the response of imagine a world where we didn't actually leave our locality. That to me would present a number of really scary, difficult challenges for the world in terms of getting along and understanding each other. So the opposite of that is if we took that argument to its very end, we'd have a lot of people who live around people and that don't get outside their comfort zone, or don't connect with people who don't necessarily look like them, think like them, speak like them. So that's a scary thought, but I'm not sure. I don't think that was the direction that anybody wanted to go in that video, but it is important to recognize that it's a bigger question when you say you should stay at home. It's a bigger set of questions. I'd like to just address really quickly my assumption is philosophically that we should be actually crossing borders and boundaries and getting outside our comfort zone and connecting with others we wouldn't normally connect with in whatever region of the world to do good things. That's just a basic kind of fundamental set of assumptions I have. But then the question for me is, how do we do that well? And what are the implications for teaching and learning if we're doing it through a higher education institution? What are the implications for research, for institutional structures, and for building capacity within communities, no matter where they are? How do we do sound community building? So if I just took the teaching and learning dimension of that, one of the things that I think is important is to think about if we are in the business of sending students and working with colleagues to go to other places to connect and build community, to make a social contribution, then we should be deeply thoughtful and reflective about that, what our assumptions are about what we think the impact is, how we work across borders and boundaries in unfamiliar places, and to make sure that that's explicit in the curriculum. So it's not surprising if you talk enough with someone in global service learning, they'll typically mention Hell with Good Intentions as an introductory article that one might provide students or share with staff and colleagues to think about what are your intentions when you do work locally, regionally, nationally, and globally. I would say in any context that's important to really understand the frameworks, the theories, the models, the approaches that you're using before you go somewhere, and to understand the context as much as possible, knowing that you could spend all your life in a particular context and not know it completely. You won't know everyone in that community. So I think the other thing, just as the last thing I'll say so the other panelists can come in, is if we're thinking about teaching and learning, one of the theories that I draw heavily from is informational learning. And what I love about that theory, when I first started doing this work in '94, I realized that the learning process that happened when I took a group of students to Nicaragua to work with partners in Nicaragua, that the learning process was very different than what I had experienced in the classroom. And so I was asking myself, what is so different about this learning process? And I came across transformational learning theory, which seemed like a very nice theory that explained how learning was happening. What I love about that theory, and we can talk about it more with the participants if you're interested, it took two major paradigms: a constructivist view of the world, that is how we shape reality, what our view of reality, and our set of assumptions are driven by that, our values, beliefs, and actions. And then this critical paradigm that talks a lot about how our set of assumptions and our view of reality is shaped by dominant interests and norms that are perpetuated through socializing institutions. And Jack Mesereau, Columbia University, combined those two paradigms. So for me, when I'm working with students or staff or colleagues, that theory invokes a critical examination of our assumptions, not only how we construct reality, but what influences how we construct reality. And it allows us to think about how our individual values, beliefs, and actions in our role in society connect with social structures, right? And so that's a really important theory that drives a lot of what I do in terms of the practical nature of this work. So if we're sending somebody, if we're going outside the classroom into a local community or a global community, we should be intimately, explicitly, intentionally aware of the assumptions that are driving our work. So I'll just leave it and the assumptions of others, and to create a space for that conversation to happen. Where I'll stop.
Okay, should I? Eric, I can't.
I think that you can go ahead, Janice. We can hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry. I muted myself and not, yeah, Janice.
Okay, cool. And that's a really useful starting point, Richard. Thanks very much for that. And I think that thinking about transformational learning is a really important methodology and approach of guiding students through very complex experiences. But I think there's kind of almost like a step backwards that we need to take before we perhaps, necessarily kind of jump into pedagogy. And just watching that video. So I'm based in Cape Town, and I have a lot of American students, mostly a lot of European students too, who come for study abroad. And I must confess that I've asked those questions exactly of those students that come to Cape Town. And I think that they're just the starting of the story. I think we need to move beyond those. And I think that the fact that I'm committed, I do believe that global service learning can play a role in assisting us to overcome very complex boundaries. But I think interestingly enough, there were just a couple of things in the video that I wanted just to highlight, because I think they tell quite a lot about the way that students can possibly naively look at situations. And there was one comment by one of the students that said something to the effect of, when he goes and study abroad, it almost feels a bit like being a heroism, and the kind of sense of excitement from people that he's involved with doing things for when he goes abroad isn't that same sense of excitement when he's doing it in his backyard. And so for him, there was this clearly a sense of he was benefiting hugely from that sense of anticipation and excitement that he experienced through participating in service in a context other than his own. That was just the one thing in the video. And then just the other issue about saving yourself, which I think in a sense one of the other people in the video speak about. Who you're saving. Are you saving the communities into which you're going, or is it actually about saving yourself? And there's a really interesting paper by Noel Salazar who talks about, he makes a differential between development tourism and developmental tourism. And he talks a lot about, when we go into other contexts, it's really about a sense of development of myself, not necessarily engaging with the local context in the way that I think it needs to be engaged. And then I just also, what I didn't hear in the video, interestingly enough, is what I'm often asked the question here, or students have often commented to me, is that when they've spoken, let's say students from the Global North have spoken to students in Cape Town and asked students, and those students from the US or from Europe obviously doing kind of service learning, perhaps in a township community or an under-resourced neighborhood. Very often I'm asked the question of why don't South African students go into those neighborhoods? When they speak to South African students, they're quite dismayed or surprised that those students haven't been into those neighborhoods. And I put the question straight back to them. Well, where you come from, do you go into those kinds of neighborhoods very different from yourself, under-resourced, just for the sake of it? So, I mean, I think it's almost trying to push back at the students and have a look at how globally we actually often very much stick to the kind of zones in which we are very comfortable in, and we don't go into uncomfortable spaces even in our own neighborhoods. And yet, students travel great distances to do that in a foreign place. And I suppose that Eric had asked me to comment on context, travel and restrictions. And I suppose that brings me to my first question of travel. It's just who can travel? What allows one to travel? Does your passport facilitate it more than for some people, more than for other people? Who can actually jump on a plane without a visa and drop off in any particular part of the world if they so choose to get involved in some form of global service or just even tourism? So I, in many ways, from a class position, in many ways, I'm aligned to the kind of class positions in the Global North. Many of us, I'm sure, in this webinar, yet I have a passport that restricts my movements. And I'm somebody with a socioeconomic position that can travel, and I often wonder about folk who don't have that same opportunity. We can't just move and travel, and so Richard's point about it's really important to be exposed and to travel boundaries and cross boundaries is really important. But increasingly, I'm seeing those boundaries are in our backyard, and I hear his point about traveling and exposing ourselves. But for folk who can't do that, how do we begin to imagine having opportunities to kind of broaden those horizons? And I think increasingly, with the world becoming more diverse, I mean, look at what's happening in Europe at the moment around the refugee and migrant crisis. There's very much a sense of there is diversity and difference right within our backyard. And maybe, we do need to begin just to trouble a little bit the notion of the geographical travel, the physical travel is perhaps the only way to do it. So that's just my kind of comment on travel. And I was, depending on our time, there was just a student that I've worked with in Cape Town over a number of months in a study abroad. She also made the observation in terms of travel that when students have completed their service, they can leave. But the communities with whom they're engaging don't have the option of leaving. They are still there. And so that notion of travel and movement expressed by a student, critical of her own practice, was that she can move on, but the communities with which she's engaged are still located perhaps and socioeconomically positioned in the same space. And I think that's just an interesting kind of critique on the travel bit that perhaps we need to talk further about. I think that's really what I wanted to do. The second one is really about restrictions, and I've kind of alluded to it already. So, who travels, who goes home, in what direction. So that's the restrictions, but just linked to the travel and linked to, I think Richard raised it, at least it's flagged in the video very, very clearly, is about what are your intentions, what are your reasons for that travel. And again, just I quite like referring to students' experiences because I wanted them to speak about their experience as opposed to me speaking about their experiences. And this student drew on the work of Laurie Pompo, I think is really interesting. She does a lot of thinking about service learning in prison contexts and the fact that those community members aren't able to move so much. And she just says, speaks about the fact that I think one of the most important things in her service experience the student gave in Cape Town are the same as the most important things I received: respect and love. I see now that service learning at its best can be an experience through which people speak their lives by the simple yet profound act of being together. And I think that helps us think about, are intentions concrete service or are they relational? And there was a really interesting article recently by Catherine Burleson, I think, in that publication that's on the Global SL website, where she talks about we need to shift from concrete to relational understandings of service. And I think that's the most that often students can experience in the context where I live, because it is quite unpredictable and it is quite fluid, and things don't necessarily work the same as they might in another context. And perhaps just my last point, and I've raised it with some of these colleagues here, so they'll recognize it, is the notion of a single story. And I think it's drawn from the work of Chimamanda Adichie and her very powerful idea that single stories we have of people or of contexts are not necessarily untrue, but they're incomplete, and we need to have multiple stories. And yes, I hear the argument that global service learning can provide the opportunity for multiple stories of us. I think that is something really valuable. And I think just the last thing, I don't want to read from the student's paper.
Janice, sorry to interrupt.
Time. Okay.
No, the time is fine. When you move your papers around, it must touch your microphone or something, because
Sorry.
no, it's all wonderful. And I'm about to share the Burleson reference you just mentioned, but when the movement gets quick, it totally drowns you out. Yeah. So you got a last point we'd love to hear, I'm sure.
Okay, so just the last point, and now we'll come back to context on this, and it's really about how contexts, they're not deterministic, but they certainly play a strong role in shaping our identity and our experience and our views of people. So she again writes of an experience. She was based in a CBO or NGO in Cape Town, and she met a dancer at this NGO. And her dancer, Ncebe, was a teacher at this NGO, and he had danced overseas in Switzerland. And I just want to read from her paper very briefly, and I'll actually my friend Ncebe told me several occasions about his experiences traveling and dancing professionally in Switzerland. One day I asked him to tell me about the kinds of people he met on his travels. What were they like? He said that the Swiss people he had met were warm and kind and always up for a good time. But he paused for a moment, frowning, before adding that although he'd stayed there for many years, he only made a handful of close friends. Most of the people he met, he said, were more occupied about hearing about his background as a South African, about his experiences as a black male, about apartheid, than they were interested in getting to know him as a person. Ncebe told me that for a time he didn't mind this, but that after a few months he began to detest the artificiality of these relationships. It wasn't until he met people who valued him for who he was, not for his exotic nationality, that he was able to remember the traits he valued in himself. And she goes on to say, Ncebe is a caring, quirky, serious, and brilliantly talented human being. To include the terms South African, male, black, and even dancer in a short list of adjectives to describe him would be doing him a disservice. And I think it just really captures also the one comment. I'll go back to that student's comment in the video of the excitement he feels or excitement he senses from people. It's in a sense that notion of the exotic is something that I've experienced with students wanting to know all about my own experience. And I think we need to just maybe trouble some of those conversations. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Janice. I see there's already questions developing. Am I getting an echo?
Yes.
Well, we'll see what Cynthia has. Hopefully there's no echo.
So briefly, let me know if you can't hear me. Oh, I hear an echo on myself too. Is that a problem? No. Okay. So I'll try to pick up where Richard and Janice left off as opposed to starting a new thread so we can feel like we're moving in a direction. I appreciate the thoughts of the transformational learning model, Richard. And Janice, thank you for reminding us of the danger of the single story. And I think that you probably have an opportunity to see that firsthand. I also recall that in conjunction with a video that's cycling now from a TED Talk. In fact, it was just passed along by Eric and a few other colleagues. Don't ask me where I'm from, but ask me where I'm a local. And this notion of thinking through identities and how students can be thinking about their own identity and then be able to translate that into action and into pro-social change So I just want to say a word or two about that. So the video for me was a bit of a reductionist model, I would say. I watched that and I felt as though it stopped at complicity and conviction and was not at all instructive about how do we bring these areas together. I know my own students come back from a global learning experience and sometimes feel that they have to do violence to either their experience overseas or to their engagement here locally, feeling like those two things don't come together. And in some ways, we've been talking about this for a long time in our field, and yet at the same time, it seems that we don't necessarily have models for how to differentiate and to marry those two together for students. The thing that I think that the video missed was the reality that global learning allows us a new lens on our identity. But by understanding these foreign cultures, that we have a better sense of our own cultural system, our own values. And that's a necessary bias of understanding if we're to make our own judgments and moral commitments to acting differently here in our own culture. So the distinction that I sometimes like to make is around students' ability to learn and understand awareness versus their ability to really get involved when it comes to engagement. So for me, it's this question that comes around active engagement for social change and how they can be most effective. So to say that there is little value in being able to move to a location and have global learning, even as you're kind of saying, Janice, sometimes that's restricted to people who have the privilege of doing that, but yet we recognize there's value in that. I would say the deeper phase 2 value comes in how do students translate that into actual action. And if we were to simply look at effectiveness, if we were to simply say, if students are going to stop at a charity versus justice model, if they're to say, okay, I feel that I'm a hero while I'm overseas in this foreign culture, and stop at how do I become an agent for positive pro-social change, there's a huge loss there. And so even last night I was with students, we did a showing of food chains, and a lot of the students there had done global service learning. And they were coming back asking about their own complicity and choices within the food system and how to make structural changes. And so I think the distinction between charity model versus justice models alongside issues of effectiveness, understanding theories of change that Richard was just putting forward, and even deeper theories of change when it comes to social structures, being able to have students think about their role in those, and even in terms of the small microcosm that a student might have, the microcosm of their action lending to greater social change when it comes to policy is, I think, part of, if there are people on this exchange that are responsible for pedagogies and for academic learning outcomes, the reality of having students to move beyond awareness to actual behavioral change and action is one of the things that we hope for. And so I would say, when I think about this distinction, I don't want to throw out global learning, moving beyond local to international, because I think it changes how we see our own culture. But when it comes to actually engaging, the idea that there's an effectiveness to move beyond just charity is necessary. So that's the first thing I'd say. The second thing I'd say is that we don't oftentimes talk about the ecological paradigm of global learning and the reality that I was struck by. In fact, I'm going to read just a statement. If anyone has come across Richard Slimbach's work on Doorstep to Planet Pedagogies, where he springboards from Wendell Berry's concepts about thinking globally here and using that as a pedagogy. Richard Slimbach does this by sending students into LA for a term before he sends them internationally because of the transition of learning and the depth of insight. But one of the things that he has in his essay is a quote from Augsburg College that says, "For most international offices have failed to grapple with the conundrum of carbon use. Global learning has a negative impact on the stability of the Earth's climate, and by extension, on the very cultures and peoples that it seeks to illuminate." And one of the realities I remember talking about with students around this issue is kind of, what is the purpose of their own education? Is it upward mobility? And with upward mobility comes an ecological cost that the Earth can't bear. And so I think appealing to students' complicit and conviction far beyond the savior mechanism and saying that they're more effective here, and also that in order for us to develop the kind of Earth and the kind of ecology that we want to be a part, then becoming a local here is one of the greatest things they can do for effectiveness. So I think that those things are kind of all tied in there. I'll stop there because I think some of the other things folks have already mentioned, and maybe just kind of open it up. I think I'll stop there and kind of see where we end up. with our discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Cynthia. I appreciated a lot of that, all of that. And I think across what I've been hearing from the panelists, just a couple of dichotomies are being highlighted, and especially when integrated with some of the comments in the chat. Those dichotomies that I'm seeing are international and domestic is one dichotomy that seems to challenge us. And you said we've been talking about this for a long time. How do we move forward? I think that's a really important question that the field is actively engaging right now on this question of global learning. And so I'm curious if the three of you have comments on how you engage global learning nearby in your different contexts and how you embrace that as a part of this picture, which itself, I would argue, is a response to the dichotomizing in the video, right? But in any case, I'm curious about how you all do that and think about that. And the other dichotomy that's really being presented in the chat is this notion of server-served as, all of us as very separate beings. And the questions in the chat are about whether we should even be still using the term service. So we have to look, or we can take that on after the global learning local question, which is what Azusa Pacific jumps into with their LA term. And I think there's some other models, but maybe this time we see, Janice, I know you do a lot of work, intentional work with this, particularly given travel context. Oh, you have a cat. I'm going to unmute you, Janice, and look forward to hearing about the way you engage this.
Engage the global in the local.
Right.
So, I think it's a really good question. I think so. In a sense, we have a to some extent, in fact, we have a global context within the local because we're part of a continent with a range of very different countries. And so there's a very interesting website, I don't know if any of you know, but called Africa as a Country. And it's basically a critique on the notion that Africa is just one country. Whereas in fact, there are, a whole range, I don't even know the total number of countries in Africa. And we have at our institution in particular, at the University of Cape Town, a lot of students from the African region. So in a sense, what we do there is we bring in the global through the continent. And what's really interesting at the Learning Change Institute, recently speaking to Paul, who's from Kenya, very different kind of reality there, even watching that video. So I think within our context, we use our continent as a way of actually looking at differences, and there are quite a lot of differences. I think the second way that we do that is really to try and grapple with the fact that the issues that we are thinking about locally have got a global footprint or have a global way of playing themselves out as well. And so we try continuously, even just at the level of making students aware of global issues. We start a lot of our learning with the global context and we bring it down to the local. So there's a sense that we're not just beginning with the local and all the challenges there, that we actually are putting the global kind of up front in our work. And that now I'm talking about with local students, I'm not talking about with international students. So we're using those in those two ways, I would argue, by looking at our continent actually as a very diverse context in and of itself. And the second of beginning some of our thinking of the local with a look at what's happening kind of more globally and actually trying to then say, how do these issues play themselves out to manifest in this particular context, maybe in a very specific way, but they're not unrelated to kind of bigger issues. So I think for instance, what's happening at the moment in Europe, just around the migration and refugee issue, we've had that in our context here hugely. We have xenophobia issues that pop up, quite regularly, unfortunately. And so I think in many ways we're able to use case studies as a way of bringing the global into the local, even if students themselves don't get to travel that way. But one thing I would quite like to experiment with more perhaps is using an online environment to link students up across contexts. To let's do what we do now with students. It's not the same as having that relationship, but I think it could go some way towards building that relationship across contexts, which our students don't get as much of an opportunity to experience. So I think just using the online space, we have fairly good broadband at home, and just using that space is one way to try and do that.
Thanks, Janice. And Before Cynthia and Richard jump in, I do want to remind everyone involved here that they can unmute themselves or send a chat at any time to further add a question or a comment, which we'd appreciate. And I also wanted to add here, Cynthia and Richard, as you're thinking about this, back to the video itself, where the student mentioned how he would be somehow valorized or put on a pedestal if he did service internationally, but this local service is somehow less interesting. Part of what I've started to wonder about is how we engage domestic community engagement in a way that troubles and disrupts national narratives and mythologies about undeserving poor. I think there's a pretty clear distinction in our national narratives about the poor in the United States and the poor elsewhere around the world. And I don't mean to be crass in saying it that way, just in terms of a national narrative. There seems to be this supposition that structural violence in so many ways occurs outside of the United States of America, and therefore people are born into less fortunate circumstances and recipients of bad dice in the gamble that is the gene pool and location of birth. But inside the United States, that's less accepted as a proposition. And I wonder if that's something that's disrupted when we do some of what Janice is saying, which is employ the local context to globally contextualize patterns of power and privilege, etc. Thanks, Jen, for your contribution.
You know, Eric, am I unmuted?
Yes, you are.
To speak to that, you know, that the whole notion of that narrative is the common person, that communication person, that totally rings my bell. But I think I actually just showed that video today in my class and with my students. And this notion of, as the student says in the video, faux heroism. What my students actually came back and said to me was that, well, we do much better fundraising when we're going abroad than when we're trying to do projects here at home. And again, I think it does speak to that notion of what is the narrative. People around, too, will view the students as doing something more meaningful when they're going abroad than when they're doing something at home. So it isn't just the student. It is a much larger, their churches step up and donate more, their families step up and donate more. And so I do think that national narrative plays into that. So while the student may want to do something local, there is that social push, if you will, to go abroad and help the more needy over there as opposed to in our backyard. And I don't know how we change that. We have a very, very negative view of poverty here and welfare, and somehow or another, here they're lazy, but there it's just systemic. And I don't know how you change that, but my class was all talking about that today, about how they were doing fundraisers for this, that, and the other, but they get a lot more response when they're trying to raise money to go with me to the Dominican over Thanksgiving than when they're trying to go for spring break to do Habitat for Humanity.
Thank you for that, Chris. And so Christine North at Ohio Northern University in Communications Department, is that right? Okay, great, thank you. I just got a question about how to make visible a chat conversation. I just want to share that. I think you can use the Control-C. If not, I've been having trouble with copy-paste there. But please jump in with the conversation if you're not able to paste it over. So Cynthia and Richard, you have a great deal to move forward on.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that hopefully this chat that I've been having will get shared more broadly, but I just wanted to highlight one thing, going way back to Janice's comment. I was very intentional not to say travel. I don't know if you remember, I said local, regional, national, and global a bunch of times. For me, this work is deeply relational, and one of the participants in a class, thank you, Jen, in class, brought this up. And I spent a lot of time, the transformational learning is an interesting theory, and it's very useful, but it invokes a process. And so I spend a lot of time on campus, institutionally, outside of campus, talking with people with how do we actually prepare to engage with people who are unlike ourselves, whether it's across race, class, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and create a dialogic process, which is intimately part of transformational learning. And so for me, one of the things in transformational learning I like is there's a trigger process, and it's sort of it's a disruption of one's worldview. And my assumption is coming into it is that we don't really understand our worldview very well. Very few of us sit there and say, hey, what's my fishbowl all about? Not let alone the fishbowl we live in, but our own fishbowl, right? It's very hard to know the sources and that drive how we think. And so I'll often ask a series of trigger questions. So for example, I'll just on your daily basis walk up to somebody that you know and say, tell me a little bit about your consciousness. Well, they'll likely look at you like you're absolutely crazy. And yet a lot of what we do in the world is based on this worldview. And so an investigation of our assumptions around how we engage, how we understand ourselves, how we understand each other, how we understand anyone moving outwards. So again, this local, regional, national, global, those are just, how we understand space and geography, but then really unpacking our assumptions and learning how to do that. And that's really hard to do. So again, when I was in the chat, I was talking about one of the things that I do is I'll ask students, when you walk into any classroom, your daily routine, they do this every day, how often do you think about the success of the person next to you? And that's just a really dissonant question, because there are very few people that raise their hand and say, oh, I do. And I know exactly how I do it. And here's my approach. So if we're actually going to expand outside the classroom, literally in outside our own doorstep, or globally, we have to literally understand how we think about building relationships and how we talk to each other and how we think about community. All those things I think have to happen before going into what could be a radically unfamiliar context and bring a set of assumptions that we haven't even unpacked. And so, and you can take that as deep as you want, but very rarely can we get to the absolute source of how we're thinking. So students walk away knowing themselves better, each other better. They can create community better typically, or at least be much more intentional about how they build relationships, how they understand their own context and the context they're going to. So I think this is it's an important dimension to think beyond just travel and geography.
I just want to add a word or two to that. Am I unmuted? Yes.
No.
Yeah.
Okay. Just a word in response to that last comment and to add to what Richard's saying. I think that we're all more comfortable when poverty has greater proximity. And so, of course, it's easier to be able to write a check to someone way over there than it is to deal with the ongoing prolonged engagement that requires a lot more personal examination and change. So I think one of the realities is that this is a human response. A human response is to be able to find it easier to want to raise money and to go than it is to stay and to simply sit in the dissonance of these really difficult structures and what our society has produced. So I just want to kind of lend a resource. Let me first say, I think sometimes if we don't take into account where we are in the 21st century, we could say this is where service learning was in the 1960s and 1970s. That we began having these conversations around race and particular contexts in the US. What's different today? What's there to be added? The global scale, I don't have to go through all the social forces that are now global that weren't the same way 50 years ago, dictates a very different response and a different understanding of student identity. So just a quick resource I want to throw out, people may already know about this, but the philosopher, kind of moral theorist, Kwame Appiah, really kind of focuses, and again, some of you might already know him, but what he helps to do is he probes this complexity and this process of personal formation, but what he does differently is he emphasizes the opportunities and the dangers about self-creating today in a kind of ethnically fluid, highly urbanized, kind of culturally hybrid world, because it is somewhat different. How to take into account all the influences that are race and ethnicity here in the US, as well as all the other forces that are shaping students' identity. So I'm not sure how those two exactly fit together, but to say, I think that education for us doesn't stop at our students. It also continues with national dialogue. I think it's something we should expect as educators. And I think we have to go deeper into the formation of our own cultural identity, kind of as Richard was saying. It is as close as the person next to you in the seat. It is just down the road in your town. But we need to be thinking as a much more this idea of doorstep to planet. What's shaping here differently and moving and changing and the complexities in order to better understand when students either go further or are unable to go further, but recognizing the world out there in a very different way.
Cynthia, thank you. I also hope it's okay to ask for this. I know it's very current, but I know you're doing a lot of work that is local in respect to food deserts and food systems. And I wonder if you could share a little bit about that. I'm just conscious that I think everybody's on the same page, and yet we're also talking at a level of theory. And I wonder if you could share a little bit about that work and how you're seeing it affect students' global learning.
Sure. I'll just say a brief word because there are probably some others on this exchange. I'm working to do an assessment of food deserts. Actually, that was last year. This year, we're working to figure out how to best address delivery services in our West Side, which is primarily an immigrant community, multifamily housing units, so some challenges in the community. And I would say for our students, fortunately, the class draws students that have already done subglobal learning. And so for them, it completely reframes the immigration debate for them. So when most of them have already been to Mexico, either through one of our study abroad or through one of our short-term alternative breaks, and they understand challenges and they recognize the need for people to migrate across borders and to join this transient migrant farm worker labor force, if you will, even with its difficulties. So they enter the situation very differently than students who haven't done that, because they enter the situation knowing that the agency for people at home and their choices are very limited. And so they come across borders out of necessity, differently than people coming in, as this is an immigration debate. And this is something that is just about policy. And so for my students, seeing those challenges adds a different kind of nuance. And I would say it's not the same as them being in Mexico and having a conversation for 2 hours as part of their daily routine. Here, it's that they leave that process of information gathering and talking with people, and they go a very short distance back to campus, recognizing the whole way that as they move that distance, it's not just distance proximally, but it's an economic distance. It's a distance of social location. And so they're not able to escape their power, their choices, their privileges in some way. And so I just, literally before this started, I got an email from a student and she said, I just got in my car last night after the movie and I just broke down and I cried for a couple of hours. I don't know how to respond. I didn't expect this, but these are different than my family's in Mexico. These are people that I feel that I really have an opportunity to be a part of their life, and I don't know how to do that and be a student. And so they're really grappling through real life issues that everybody on this exchange grapples through. I grapple through. How do I continue to be engaged locally and also to be a person who is a mother, who is an academic? These are things that we have to fit into our life. And I think it's a phase 2 for students about social engagement and pro-social change.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that. It really helped contextualize. And I do have a comment. Richard, maybe I see there's been a nice exchange on monolingualism in this space. And of course, with no irony, we have partnered in a way that features international yet all English contributions here. Or with no sense of the irony as it was put together. But in any case, I did want to mention, similarly, I would argue, as to the national mythologies on deserving, poor, undeserving, I'm personally quite troubled currently. Clearly, refugees in Europe and respect for those rights are important to me. I don't know if anyone caught it. Sonia Nazario had an op-ed in the Times about the United States of America essentially outsourcing violent restrictions on people flows to the southern Mexico border. And as we as the United States have a dialogue on Europe's insensitivity, we continue to engage very violent mechanisms on our southern border and then export them further south. So troubling these narratives seems to me continuously important and really valuable in how you're doing it there in Westmont. Richard, Monolingualism. I was really interested. You said you keep some exercises in your back pocket to bring out reflection on monolingualism and its impacts. What are you thinking of?
Well, I think, am I unmuted?
Yes.
I think, I've, prior to doing service learning from around 81 to about 92, 93, I lived in a lot of different countries, not necessarily doing service learning or community engagement, but getting to know the local community well and just living, for example, living in Madrid for 4 years gave me an opportunity to build relationships in a variety of contexts. And not surprisingly, this was from 87 to 91. I lived there, and prior to this as well, experiences, I'd often find a lot of critiques. People would identify me as American, someone who speaks English, male, and so on. But the Americanness was very prevalent most of the time when I was relating to others, whether I agreed with that or not. And so it was something that I wanted to navigate much more intentionally, because often the assumption was negative about American influence overseas. And a lot of the folks that I was engaging with had very different ideas about political and economic systems, military, spheres of influence, bipolar world, and the impact of a bipolar world at that time. Bipolar, interesting way to think about the world. And so I started trying to understand, what is the source of that sort of, in some cases, really aggressive behavior toward me. During the First World War, people would sit down literally when I was eating lunch or dinner and say, I want to talk to you about Americans' involvement in the Gulf War, or I want to talk to you about, Americans and how they approach this. And so I had to figure out ways to respond to that because I didn't have the answers that they were looking for, but I felt very uncomfortable. And what was really interesting is one way to do that, and this is what I try to model in the classroom, is understanding the historical relationship you have if people are identifying you in a particular way. So in this case, what is the U.S. relationship to Spain? And I noticed that they would use certain language to describe that was pejorative, despectivo. And so one example is almost everyone I met would say leche polvo. And for folks that don't speak Spanish, powdered milk. And I'd say to them, what is powdered milk? Why do they keep saying powdered milk? What is it about leche polvo? Well, it turns out everyone, grandma, little kid, teenager, knew leche polvo. And what they were influenced by is in their conception of the Marshall Plan, and the influence of the Marshall Plan was that all they got from the Marshall Plan was leche polvo. And that influenced in decades of how people understand U.S.-American relations. The other thing, and this might be a little bit more vulgar irony, but so if you walk around Madrid or other countries, you might see some expression in graffiti or something that says, "Go home, American." In Spain, the term is "Yankee, go home." And so you could go and investigate, well, what's the origin of Yankee? Where does that come from? Why do they want us to go home? And so often the term that's used again in a negative sense is Yankee cabron. I won't go into that, but it's not a pleasant term, right? It's a negative way of understanding Americans. So I used to introduce myself as Yankee cabron. And it just shifted the nature of the conversation. It immediately conveyed that I'm aware of a set of assumptions that you might have, the language that you're using, some of the sources of that language, and I'd like to shift the way this relationship is, the way we're engaging this relationship. Now, I'm not suggesting to the group out there that they introduce themselves as Yankee cabron, but there is a fair amount of, I noticed patterns in a lot of the countries I went to, they usually have a word for Americans that's pejorative, and understanding that word and understanding the source of that word and the language used around that, and then opening it up to irony, I find is helpful, because it's, instead of getting into a defensive posture, that's another kind of way of relating. It's much more saying, I think I understand you. I'm trying to grapple with this. And I'm actually even allowing myself to use a little bit of humor, irony to engage with this. And again, this is stuff that I used to experiment with when I was living in other countries, when I recognized that there are a lot of people that perceive Americans in very negative ways, and they're perceiving me, my identity, in that way. And I'm trying to get outside that narrow way of thinking about identity. So, and there are nonverbal ways to do that as well. But those are just some examples I like to bring up to students that beg questions about, do you understand the history of your relationship with that country if your relationship is constituted by your nationality? And you can take that, any structural element, you can take it in terms of gender. Based on your gender, when you go into this context, how does gender play out, and what's your connection to that? So if you start acting in ways that are based on your conception of gender in your own context, and the majority perceptions of people in another context of gender are very different, then how do you navigate that? How do you negotiate that? What terms are used? What language? So those are just some ideas to throw out there.
Appreciate that, Richard. And, it reminds me of how much you've seen in your research that students are looking to faculty as models in various ways of disrupting assumptions and navigating the challenges. And whether that's in the employment of irony or otherwise, they're watching very carefully often.
I want to just say one thing, and I want to also say there's a tremendous amount of vulnerability in that. So I don't want to say this is easy work. It's outside people's comfort zone.
Right, and that relates to, Jen, I don't know you personally, but you've been asking many interesting questions on the messengers, and I was wondering if you'd be willing to unmute and share a little bit about where you're coming from in respect to the language piece, and also invite Nevin Brown to respond. He's got a lot of history and work in this space after you're done sharing.
Sure, thanks. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. So I run a partnership in Ecuador, in Southeast Ecuador, through the University of Cuenca with an indigenous community outside of Cuenca. And one of the things that I have found to be fascinating is I think students are very willing to have their unquestioned assumptions about monolingualism unpacked. So they've been very, I think there's a lot of shame that comes with it. There's a lot of, we work for 6 months before we ever go. But at the same time, they understand. What I'm finding fascinating is the institutional, what's the best way to say, the institutional kind of indifference to the fact that I have colleagues all over. I'm at Ohio State. I have faculty colleagues that are doing great work and wanting to do great work all over the world that do not pay any attention to the fact that they have been going to Nicaragua for 20 years and don't know Spanish. Whereas, I've been in this Ecuador project for 5 years and was a Spanish major in college, but never had any money to go abroad. So it's been 5 years where I'm studying Spanish at our local community college, at the University of Cuenca, and trying to get people to understand how the nature of the relationships that we can even build institutionally. And then if we talk about, my commitment to engaging with parents and engaging with the teachers and the community folks in Cañar where we stay or where we work, is very much mitigated by my ability to speak the language with or without the translator only can do so much. And so this, the hard work, I think, and I think, Richard, your point is well taken, that role modeling, that willingness to look silly and have, la profesora speak broken Spanish, giving a speech on the importance of the wind in Andean cosmology, it's humorous, but it goes a long way for students. But I'm having a hard time getting the institution to think about, if we're really talking about relationships and we're not talking about dominant service paradigms, what do we need to be doing around a conversation about monolingualism, and at least what are our commitments to trying to shift some of that? And I'm with you, Cynthia. I got 2 kids and I'm an academic and a basketball coach and all sorts of goofy stuff. And I don't know how to do it, but there's not a lot of support, and we're not really talking about what are our capacities as the people who are leading that. What are our responsibilities as the people who are leading these things? So that's where I'm coming from.
Thanks. Thank you, Jen. And we have met on email, but yeah. So great to see you and have you participating here today. I wonder, Nevin, I didn't prepare you to be presenting, but I see you've unmuted yourself, so you have a lot to
I'm here.
Yeah.
Well, and maybe I'm a little different than many of you, except for Janice in South Africa, that I'm actually most of the time I'm outside the US, so I'm talking to you from Italy. And our program here is all about cultural and language immersion. And most of our students come to Italy with all kinds of preconceptions about Italy and with no knowledge of Italian language. So our challenge is to figure out, how do we immerse students in this culture, including getting them to speak the language? And I think we do a reasonably good job at that. But we're not given any support from the home institutions, because so many universities in the US now do not require students to study a foreign language. And so there's not the kind of encouragement or support from many of the home institutions to help us do that part of this job. The other question I have, though, about language is, and this is about doing this work at home versus doing it overseas. And there are all kinds of issues, as we're talking about the difficulties and the problems by just shipping American students overseas. But I want, at least when it comes to becoming proficient in a language, how do you do that in the US? When it's so easy to step out of, for example, if you're working in an Hispanic community, it's really easy to step out of it and all of a sudden be speaking English again. Whereas at least here in Italy, at least in Siena, which is a very Italian city, it's much harder to do that. And I just found myself wondering, at least for language purposes, how do we do that domestically to help students be able to become proficient in a second language? And I guess I don't have any answers to that, but it's a big worry that I have, because I think Americans are becoming less rather than more able to speak foreign languages. And I think that's a real disadvantage for us.
Yeah, thank you, Nevin. And I just want to address a couple of housekeeping things before we see who would like to comment next. Someone asked if the chat posts will be available afterward. Yes, they will. I just need to remember to copy them and send them to you. And also, I did want to mention, I haven't seen extensive research on this question, but I have seen some research that suggests that that students who go with less language capacity often return and seem to, in a statistically significant way, be more interested in language learning afterward. Now, to me, that's interesting, and in some ways might provide some argument in favor of permitting students to go on shorter-term programs, as I often jokingly refer to shorter-term programs as gateway drugs to significant global learning experiences. But so that might be interesting. I'll see what others have to say. But the other thing, I'm really struck by Jen's attentiveness to the faculty role on this, and I think the willingness of faculty to stay in a less I guess linguistically skilled space is a real issue, especially when we think about the importance of modeling that we were talking about and highlighting earlier. Chris, did you have a comment? You sent me a message suggesting you may.
Yeah, actually I do. You know, it's really interesting, Jen's point is, and well, actually everyone, Nevin, I feel you on this, and I don't have an answer for you either. One of the things that's happened, I think, is a lot of institutions have actually created a lack of support. I know our institution, when we revamped our gen ed, took away the language requirement. Who does that in a liberal arts college? Takes away the language requirement. So now we have fewer and fewer students taking languages. But one of the things that I've noticed is I've had the opportunity to teach abroad in other countries. And I've taught in Alicante in Spain, and I've had the opportunity to teach in Costa Rica. And so these are language immersion programs. And when I'm there, the students are not availing themselves of language immersion. So while I'm there, I'm busy talking to them in Spanish outside of class, walking to and from the university, and they're busy talking to each other in English. They're wanting to go to the local McDonald's. And I'm like, no, guys, you're not getting it. You're missing the point. We are here in whichever country we're in. The point is that we are in immersion. If you're going to talk to me, you're going to talk to me in Spanish. That's what we're here to do. And I'm here to learn with you, and I will make as many mistakes as you do, and I take classes right alongside them. and I make the same mistakes they do in order to learn it. So it's a matter of finding folks who are engaged. And it is an interesting phenomenon. I travel with other faculty. I am the only one who goes down to the Dominican Republic who can speak Spanish. It is interesting. It creates an interesting dynamic. On one hand, I have people who are very grateful that I can, but it creates some animosity with my colleagues because I can. And now all of a sudden they're ticked off because they can't establish those same kinds of relationships, and they can't develop or coordinate or work with in the same ways that I can. And then that creates a little bit of jealousy, and that creates some animosity. And it's, you know, I talk about the fact that, hey guys, we need to become bilingual. And I talk to my students. I do have a number of students who come back from a trip with me to the Dominican and decide that they want to get a minor in a language. A lot of my students are wanting to minor in Spanish. They're pharmacy majors, or they're a pre-professional, pre-medical major. And they recognize that even within the United States, there's a great need to have some of that language proficiency. And all of a sudden, so Eric, like you were saying, that notion that I've been abroad, now all of a sudden I have a propensity and a motivation to learn it, and they have more of an interest in coming back. But even while they're out there, I do notice that students, if they're hanging around other American students, they're going to speak English, even if they're in an immersion program, and trying to get them to do otherwise, trying to impress that upon them is difficult. And likewise with the faculty. So Jen, I hear you. It's a real struggle because I think there is, again, that sort of ethnocentric view of everyone will speak English with me, so why should I have to? And yet I know I have relationships and have been able to do things, and my Spanish is far from perfect. But broken Spanish or not, I can get through it, and they laugh at me and I make mistakes.
Thanks, Chris. I think that it brings up a lot of points that relate to any time we all have access, and reminds me of actually the social media conversations. I want to draw a parallel quickly here, and then think about a resource in that area, how it might align here, and then actually move to this service language, the language of service conversation, as we just have about 18 minutes left, I think. Richard Slimbach, who many of you know his work in this area, he has a very well-structured way of, first of all, just sharing the conversation with students about social media. And right now I'm thinking about social media. I think social media offers a parallel here because essentially we have opportunities to communicate in ways in which we're familiar and comfortable, and we know that deeper learning is not necessarily aligned with always taking up that opportunity, right? So they have that conversation well before going, but he sets up a set of rubrics that students keep track of, like personal diaries. This is where I am with my Facebook usage this week while I'm in Uganda. It fits my expectations, or it well exceeds, or I find myself not wanting to at all. This continuous check-in and reflection that builds a kind of self-monitoring around what we all know. And students, you know, as we have conversations with them, will agree with us on what's best in terms of intentionality around language. But it's hard. I'm a less than sophisticated Spanish speaker myself. It's hard to continuously pull myself into Spanish rather than English. And of course, as my colleagues at universities in South America so often are very skilled with English, making it even a step harder. As you all know, I see a lot of nodding on that. So how do we monitor that? Slimbach's been really generous with sharing resources in the past. I'll try to pick this up from him and make sure it gets shared out at Global SL in the coming weeks. I think it would be relevant for the language conversation too. So Janice, you're absolutely right. Language is much more than just language. It's history, experience, and being as well. And that question of being actually relates to this dialogue that's been spinning here on the chat stream about whether we call it service learning or service, or want to give up that language, what's really happening here. And by way of introduction, let me just share that I'm a person that can easily get frustrated when conversations seem to be semantic only. And I do want to say that this conversation is well beyond semantic only. I've certainly come to appreciate and see that. it seems to me the challenge is how do we communicate beyond our little community about what's involved here and what's happening. So I'm interested to hear how you all have been speaking about it and talking about it and thinking about it. For my own part, I've been really moved to see more and more of the language of accompaniment and relational knowing that I associate with faith traditions coming involved in the service learning movement. I do think that's really important. Yet we're still operating in ways that might not intersect with dominant discourse. But language of service. Richard, Janice, we haven't heard from you in a little while. You're probably ready to, I know you have a lot of profound thoughts on this.
No, yeah, my head is kind of, I mean, the language of service. Yeah, I mean, I've found myself actually inverting service and learning and speaking more about learning service, just that we make assumptions about the service aspect. And I think through not making the assumptions about it, we can do some really useful, and I want to use the word ontological work. I think we can do some really good work around who we are in the game. And if I could just slip something in and then I'll actually give over to others, it's just, I think we don't focus enough on faculty and their language. How are they prepared? What are they thinking about? So a lot of our efforts go talking about the kinds of dispositions that students need and how we need to work with students. And I think we kind of gloss over, I feel anyway, we gloss over the faculty role in that. And it's come up a bit in this language thing about how faculty are monolingual. But even in the broader thing, not just around language, I think that, you know, we as faculty need to do quite a lot of ontological work ourselves around where we're sitting with all the assumptions and stereotypes and views. And I think that's a project that is maybe a bit, I don't want to use the word scary, but it kind of speaks to vulnerability. It speaks to uncertainty. It speaks to, you know, really shifting perhaps aspects of our identity. And I think we require so much of that from our students. And yet I think we don't focus enough in the literature and the research on that process for ourselves. So whether it relates to the languages per se or to the you know, a lot of the issues we've touched on tonight, I think it's just that we assume somehow faculty can cope with all those really complex issues that our students are navigating. And so, somehow we are these multi-skilled experts, and we're not actually. We're simply human beings engaging with other human beings. And I think we need to give more attention to faculty. So that's my last little bit. And I think particularly of myself, my own positionality, my whiteness, living in South Africa, I grapple with that continuously in my practice and the privilege that comes with it, and just what that links me up to this conversation today like this. So I think we don't grapple enough with our own whiteness, our own privilege in as faculty and as teachers. And I think I just want to put that P in there. Sorry, it's a bit off the map in terms of language, but I think it's a white elephant we don't talk about. Sorry, it's a bit of a strong view, but I just think that, you know, I think all the other stuff is good and well, but we are so core to all of this, and we have such a lot of authority and power in many ways. We have to begin to unpack some of that. So, sorry, it was a bit off your language question, Eric.
No, not at all. It's absolutely on point. I was interested in talking about the learning service learning conversation, and shared your contribution on that from the Michigan Journal, which is right. Really beautiful piece. Wonder if others have thoughts on this dichotomy of the serving served that often comes up in our work.
I mean, I guess I think one of the things that I take as a good sign is when my students are asking me the question, why are we still calling this service learning? This doesn't seem like service learning. One of the, and I take that as a good sign, and my response has been, why can't it be service learning? Why can't this be what it is that we're doing? And we spend a lot of time critiquing the discourse as well as the practice of, I think I picked this up at one of the international service learning research conferences, that development by monument, the idea that our students are often unsatisfied if they can't come back with pictures of something that they built or some sort of physical representation of their time in, of how their time was spent, and talking about can it not be enough to just be in relationship, bearing witness to one another's lived experiences. And students, I think the fact that they get to the point of grappling about, Jen, you need to call this something other than service learning. This is not what this is. But I pose this to you all because my response has been, well, why can't it be? But I wonder, because I don't want it to be just about semantics. There's the idea of, can we reinscribe something that I think becomes very distasteful to students once they're really engaged in sort of the ethics behind it and the way in which just deep engagement in relationships doesn't feel like service to them. And so anyway, I pose that to the group because my students pose it to me every year, multiple times.
I just wanted to just fully and completely agree with that point. I tend to work with students at this phase of life that have migrated from a space that was originally mission. And we've had missions long before we've had service learning. And so I find that the term service cannot be used without the power dynamic placing communities at the receiving end. So there's always going to be a service given and a service received. And so I know there's a movement to not call things service. On our campus, I'm trying to move toward co-educators, constantly saying, calling communities either communities and representatives or partners or co-educators, but I'm trying really hard not to move back into service learning language only because we don't have the nuanced complexities of speaking about them. We don't have the ability to critically reflect yet. And so I think sometimes students get there more quickly than the rest of our administration and faculty. And so I agree with you. I think the term service as a field of study is valuable to name it service learning. I think to use that vernacular on a daily basis with students and in communities, I think is very dangerous because it makes us complicit in this unspoken power hierarchy that we are creating and then living through. So just want to note the importance of it, and then that there is a function for service learning because we have this 4 decades old literature that I think we need to be able to find and to reference. But I think working with students, it does become dangerous not to call people co-educators and equal partners.
Two things. I appreciate that. I find myself in alignment with everything that's being said, and I'm also struck by 2 challenges or complications, which for anyone to comment on. One is we've observed to great extent how this is a marketplace phenomenon, right? The study abroad sector and international education, and even the voluntourism sector that's often distinct from study abroad. It's a massively growing marketplace, and that marketplace has interest in continuing the language of service because it rewards everyone's stereotypes. And part of the question, and I suppose this is what some of the work I've done with others and with Amazaji, the terminology of fair trade learning is attempting to disrupt the marketplace language sufficiently to allow a space here. I still find myself challenged by it and wonder how we can recruit students to disruptive, hopefully transformative programs without potentially without using the language of service or service learning. And the other thing that occurs to me is that we're not always, so one of the interesting things in development and in community development is the notion of outsider as catalyst. And sometimes outsiders do bring skills. So I think maybe community engagement and Community Engaged does this. Communicate that oftentimes communities do want to see outsiders bringing particular skill sets, and that is part of the promise of relational exchange. So I'm wondering how we keep all of this as we work to move forward. Thanks, Cynthia, for sharing that resource.
I just want to echo, I guess, what most people have said here. The service can be highly problematic. And so if we're going to invoke the term again, for me, it's another concept, idea, activity that we need to problematize and kind of surface assumptions around that. I do think that what I struggle with is the way the field, I want to make sure, just because I'm in an institutional role and then the field-based role, that people don't forget, as Cynthia mentions, there's decades of work around this terminology. So on the one hand, I use it to honor and affirm and build off of previous knowledge that's been generated by a lot of people who have used that terminology, and prior to that, community service, and prior to that, volunteerism, and so on and so forth, and going all the way back to mission work, and prior to that, and prior to that. So I do think it's important. And so I struggle with, now in my own work and here institutionally, we're not using the term service learning, and we made an intentional choice to do that. But what I find happens is that people now are confused about whether or not there's an actual field. And so that's problematic for me, because then it discounts the potential for discounting and not recognizing that there's a whole field around this is really problematic. So I feel like we're in this interesting transition period, linguistic transition period, of how to frame the field. So it even has implications for our the website Global Service Learning, Global SL, which SL, refers to service learning. Something that I think would be really useful to chat about further, in other contexts, or even on this particular, social media.
Thank you, Richard. I've started to claim we're not sure what the SL stands for, just for the record. Could be student learning, could be Southern leadership. But in any case, Nathan, I see your chat and just wonder if you wouldn't mind sharing a minute or two of what that looks like, the conversation in place that you engage in Brazil. You'll have to unmute yourself if you're willing. There you are.
Damn you, Eric. I thought I was going to get through without having to speak. I don't know. I think it's kind of like the way you go to a bar and have a drink with a friend, or invite people into your home. There's an opportunity to just be authentic that I think we squander too often in travel, or staying, to not use the word that Richard is calling us to be careful not to overuse. But I think we're actively creating shared space for engagement. That's like maybe the best way to boil down and reduce what we're doing. And if we do that in such a way that we're insisting that anyone present is invited to speak, and that the purpose of our being together and a potential outcome of our conversation could be to insist that we build relationships where we're better equipped to build a better world, then the idea is broad. It's like service to a higher calling, and service itself, problematized, as Cynthia said, as it is, can then be sort of a shared thing, right? We're in service to a thing we all can get behind. I don't use the word service very often, but if I use it, I only use it in that way, right? That we're in service to doing something together. And that's it.
Thank you for sharing that, Nathan, despite your displeasure. So that leaves us in the final minute, and I think I really appreciate Nathan's sense of actively creating shared space for engagement being central to the work we're doing. And I would say that both in particular and specific community contexts, but it also really appeals to me in terms of the effort that Global SL has undertaken in terms of using online spaces like this. And thank you, Jen, for the recent comment. Sorry, I've lost it because it's jumped up, but about connecting with colleagues willing to be challenged and energized by the complexities and trying to do better. That is essentially what we're about, understanding what this journey is all about. I see Bob has already done what I'm about to suggest, which is sending suggestions for webinars in the future. We're very eager to keep conversations going and keep growing through sharing resources with one another. I will right now copy the chat stream so that we are able to access that in the future. And this webinar recording will be available and accessible. I'll email all of you with the link and also email all of you with an evaluation of your experience, and would really appreciate it if you do take the time to fill that out. Thank you so much for joining today. Really appreciate your time, your talents, and your thoughts.
Bye.
Bye.